A routine flight home turns into a nightmare of humiliation. On a sold-out American Airlines flight from LAX, a distinguished black woman, a doctor, is targeted in her first-class seat. A flight attendant dripping with condescension and a stone-faced police officer try to forcibly remove her, convinced she doesn't belong. The cabin holds its breath, phones recording the escalating drama. But as the officer puts his hand on her arm, the cockpit door swings open. The pilot emerges, his face a mask of thunder, and utters 5 words that will ignite a firestorm of consequences. "Get your hands off my wife." The hum of Los Angeles International Airport was a familiar symphony to Dr. Aris Thorne. As a leading pediatric cardiac surgeon, she navigated airports with the same practiced ease she did an operating theatre. Today, however, was different. It wasn't a medical conference or a guest lecture that had her settling into seat 2B in the first-class cabin of American Airlines Flight 1242 to Chicago. It was a long overdue vacation, 2 weeks of blissful anonymity with her husband, David. The buttery leather of the seat was a welcome comfort. She'd just wrapped up a grueling 72-hour stretch at the hospital, culminating in a complex, life-saving surgery on a newborn. The exhaustion was bone-deep, a familiar ache she usually wore as a badge of honor. But now she was shedding that skin, ready to be just Aris, not Dr. Thorne. She slid her carry-on, a well-worn leather satchel filled with medical journals, and one trashy novel for the beach under the seat in front of her. She noticed the flight attendant, a woman whose name tag read Brenda, watching her from the galley. Brenda had a pinched face and hair sprayed into a helmet of improbable stiffness. Her smile, when it occasionally appeared for other passengers, was a quick, brittle thing that didn't reach her eyes. As Aris settled in, Brenda's gaze lingered a flicker of something that Aris couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't hostility, not yet, but a cool, appraising look that made the fine hairs on Aris's arms prickle. Aris, accustomed to being one of the few black women in many professional spaces, had a finely tuned radar for this kind of scrutiny. She met the attendant's gaze and offered a small, polite smile. Brenda looked away without acknowledging it. A long flight ahead, Aris thought, pulling out her noise-cancelling headphones. She sent a quick text to David boarding now. "See you soon, my love." David, a captain for the same airline, was flying a different route and was scheduled to land in Chicago just an hour after her. They would meet at their hotel, kick off their shoes, and for 2 weeks the only lives they would be responsible for were their own. The thought sent a wave of relief through her. The boarding process continued. A businessman in an ill-fitting suit grunted as he heaved his oversized bag into the overhead bin, nearly clocking her in the head. She flinched back, and he offered no apology. Brenda, however, rushed over to him. "Oh, let me help you with that, sir," she cooed, her voice dripping with saccharine sweetness. "We can't have you straining yourself before your flight." Aris watched the exchange, a knot tightening in her stomach. It wasn't just in her head. Brenda's service was selective. A few minutes later, a young couple, giddy with excitement, took the seats across the aisle. They were holding hands, snapping selfies, and bubbling about their honeymoon. Brenda was instantly at their side, offering them pre-departure champagne with a flourish. "Congratulations, you two. Can I get you anything else to make your flight more special?" Aris, who had been offered nothing, felt a familiar pang of invisibility. It was a subtle, insidious thing, this tiered level of service. She wasn't thirsty, but the principle of it stung. It was the quiet, everyday cut that was often harder to fight than overt aggression. How do you complain that someone was too nice to everyone else while offering you only a cold shoulder? You'd be branded as difficult as playing a card that no one wanted to see. So Aris said nothing. She closed her eyes, focusing on the thrum of the airplane, the promise of David's arms around her, in just a few hours. The final passenger for first class boarded. He was a portly man in a golf shirt who huffed and puffed as he settled into the seat next to Aris. He immediately encroached on her space, his elbow resting firmly on their shared armrest. Aris subtly shifted, trying to reclaim her sliver of territory, but he was immovable, a fleshy monolith. He didn't even glance at her. The cabin door was about to close when Brenda made her way down the aisle, her eyes scanning the seats. Her gaze landed on Aris again, and this time it was sharp and direct. "Ma'am," Brenda said, her voice loud enough to cut through the cabin's low hum. "I need to see your boarding pass." The request was jarring. Everyone else was settled. No one else was being asked. Aris felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. All eyes were suddenly on her. The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. The honeymooners paused their giggling. Her seatmate, the armrest hog, finally turned to look at her, his expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Of course," Aris said, her voice even betraying none of the sudden anxiety churning within her. She reached into her satchel, her fingers fumbling for the slip of paper. The simple act felt monumental under the weight of a dozen stares. She was being singled out, put on display. She handed the pass to Brenda. The flight attendant took it, her manicured nails tapping against the paper as she scrutinized it. She held it up to the light as if expecting the ink to dissolve and reveal a forgery. "Dr. Aris Thorne," Brenda read aloud, her tone laced with a theatrical disbelief. She looked from the pass to Aris, then back again. "This says, Seat 2B. "Yes." Aris confirmed, her patience fraying. "That's this seat." Brenda's lips thinned into a razor-straight line. "There must be some mistake. This is a first-class cabin." The implication hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. "You don't belong here." "I'm aware of that," Aris said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm. "I purchased a first-class ticket. Is there a problem?" The word "purchased" seemed to amuse Brenda. She let out a small, condescending laugh. "Sometimes there are system errors, upgrades that don't process correctly. Perhaps your actual seat is in the main cabin. I can help you find it." It was the "help you" that was the most insulting part. It was the patronizing offer to escort the lost, confused black woman back to where she belonged. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot poker pressing against her sternum. "There is no mistake," Aris said, her voice steel. She held Brenda's gaze, refusing to be cowed. "This is my seat. I am not moving." The cabin was silent, a vacuum of suspended breath. The man next to her shifted uncomfortably, pulling his arm back slightly. The businessman was now openly staring. Brenda's manufactured smile returned, but this time it was all teeth. "I'm sorry you feel that way," she said, though she sounded anything but. "But we have a passenger who is ticketed for this seat. I'm going to have to ask you to deplane, and we can sort this out at the gate." A lie. A bold-faced, blatant lie. The cabin was fully boarded. There was no other passenger waiting. Brenda had simply decided that Aris was a problem to be removed, a discrepancy to be corrected. "You're asking me to leave the plane?" Aris asked, her voice incredulous. "That's right," Brenda said, her chin jutting out. "Unless you want to be removed." The threat was clear. The "or else" was a silent promise of force and further humiliation. Aris's heart pounded against her ribs, a frantic trapped bird. She thought of David. She thought of their vacation. She thought of the countless times she had swallowed her pride, smiled politely, and endured the 1,000 tiny cuts of prejudice to avoid a scene. Not today. Not this time. "I am a ticketed passenger in my assigned seat," Aris stated, her voice resonating with an authority that made Brenda's smile falter for a second. "I will not be deplaning. If you have an issue, you can call your supervisor. But I am not going anywhere." Brenda's face hardened into a mask of righteous indignation. "Fine," she snapped, turning on her heel. "I'll do just that. And someone else." Aris knew who that someone else was. She watched Brenda march toward the front of the plane, her stiff posture a testament to her fury. Aris took a deep, shaky breath, the recycled air feeling thin and useless. She could feel the stares of the other passengers like physical blows. Some were sympathetic, but most were simply wary, eager to avoid being drawn into the conflict. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't call David. She didn't want to worry him. Instead, she opened her camera app and discreetly started recording, resting the phone on her lap, the lens angled upwards. If she was going to be removed, the world was going to see why. The quiet hum of the cabin had been replaced by a tense, waiting silence. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. The silence in the first-class cabin stretched taut and fragile. It was broken only by the occasional nervous cough and the rustle of a magazine. Aris kept her phone, recording her gaze fixed on the entrance to the jet bridge. Her mind, usually a calm sea of clinical analysis, was a raging tempest. Every microaggression she had ever faced seemed to be coalescing into this single ugly moment. It was the security guard who had followed her through a high-end department store, the colleague who had assumed she was a nurse, the patient who had demanded to see a real doctor. They were all here in this pressurized cabin, embodied by the smug certainty of a flight attendant named Brenda. Brenda returned, and she was not alone. Flanking her was a ground supervisor, a harried-looking woman named Maria, and behind them, filling the doorway, was an officer from the Los Angeles Airport Police. The officer was a big man, broad and impassive. His name tag read Sutton. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the cabin from tense to volatile. The sight of his uniform, his hand resting casually on his holstered weapon, was a clear and potent symbol of power. He was here to enforce, not to mediate. "Ma'am," Maria the supervisor began, her voice strained. "Brenda has informed me there's some confusion about your seating." "There is no confusion," Aris said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. "There is, however, a flight attendant who seems to have a problem with my presence in this cabin." Brenda scoffed. "I have a problem with people who don't follow the rules. We have a passenger who is supposed to be in this seat." "Who?" Aris challenged, looking past them. "Where is this mysterious passenger?" "The flight is fully boarded." Maria looked at Brenda, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Brenda, is there another passenger waiting?" Brenda's face flushed. He's waiting at the gate." There was a mix-up with his connection. It was a clumsy, transparent lie. Officer Sutton stepped forward, his shadow falling over Aris. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a flat, unemotional baritone, "we need you to step off the plane so we can figure this out." "I have figured it out," Aris replied, looking him directly in the eye. "I am in the seat I paid for. You are being used to enforce a flight attendant's personal bias." "That's a serious accusation," Sutton said, his eyes narrowing. He was no longer emassive. A hint of annoyance had crept into his tone. "This is a serious situation," Aris retorted. "I am being targeted and humiliated in front of an entire plane for no reason other than the fact that this woman, She gestured to Brenda, "does not believe I belong in first class." The man in the seat next to Aris, who had been silent until now, decided to weigh in. "Look, lady, just do what they say." He grumbled, his voice thick with impatience. "Some of us have places to be. Stop making a scene." "I'm not the one making a scene," Aris shot back, her gaze snapping to him. "I was sitting here quietly, bothering no one." Brenda seized the opportunity. "See, she's disturbing the other passengers. She's being disruptive." "Disruptive?" Aris's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You accost me, lie about my ticket, and call the police on me, and I'm the one being disruptive." Officer Sutton's patience, thin to begin with, was clearly gone. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. You can leave the aircraft under your own power, or I will remove you." The finality in his voice was chilling. Aris felt a jolt of genuine fear. This was how stories on the news began. A routine interaction that spiraled into violence, a headline, a hashtag. Her career, her reputation, her physical safety, all of it felt suddenly precarious. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice rising slightly. "What crime have I committed? Failure to obey the instructions of a flight crew is a federal offense," Sutton stated, reciting the line as if from a script. "Now are you going to walk, or am I going to carry you?" His hand moved from his weapon and came to rest on her arm. The touch was electric. It was a violation, a crossing of a line that galvanized her. The fear was instantly replaced by a white-hot, clarifying anger. "Get your hand off of me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper that seemed to crackle in the silent cabin. Sutton's grip tightened. "Let's go." It was then that a new voice sliced through the tension. A voice that was calm, authoritative, and laced with an icy fury that was more terrifying than any shout. "What seems to be the problem here?" Every head whipped towards the front of the plane. The cockpit door was open. Standing there, silhouetted against the bright lights of the instrument panel, was the pilot. He was tall and lean, his uniform immaculate, the 4 stripes on his epaulets gleaming. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept across the scene, taking in Brenda's smug face, the supervisor's anxiety, the police officer with his hand on Aris's arm, and finally Aris herself. His expression, which had been one of professional curiosity, morphed into something else entirely. It was a look of pure, unadulterated rage. Brenda, seeing her captain, immediately straightened up, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She had been vindicated. The ultimate authority was here to back her up. "Captain Thorne," she began, her voice oozing deference, "I am so sorry to disturb you. This woman was refusing to move from a seat that isn't hers and was becoming disruptive. Officer Sutton was just helping me escort her from the aircraft." Captain David Thorne didn't look at Brenda. His gaze was locked on the police officer's hand on Aris's arm. He took 2 measured steps forward, his presence seeming to suck all the air out of the cabin. The authority he projected was absolute, far eclipsing that of the airport cop. This was his plane, his domain. "Officer," David said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you have 3 seconds to take your hand off my wife." The words hung in the air, each one a perfectly weighted stone, dropped into a silent pool. My wife. The ripple effect was instantaneous and seismic. Officer Sutton snatched his hand back from Aris's arm as if he'd been burned. His face, moments before a mask of bored authority, was now a canvas of stunned confusion. His brain seemed to be short-circuiting, trying to reconcile the image of the disruptive woman with the pilot's protective fury. Brenda's triumphant smirk dissolved. Her mouth fell open a silent O of disbelief. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, mottled complexion that clashed with her garish pink lipstick. She looked from the pilot, Captain Thorne, to the woman in seat 2B, Dr. Aris Thorne. The shared surname, which she had read with such theatrical scorn from the boarding pass, now slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The supervisor, Maria, looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. Her eyes darted between the captain and her flight attendant, the dawning horror of the situation clear on her face. Even the boorish man in the next seat, who had been so eager for Aris to be removed, recoiled, pressing himself against the window as if trying to merge with the fuselage. The honeymooning couple across the aisle stared their phones, now also held up no longer for selfies, but to capture the unfolding drama. Aris felt a wave of dizzying relief wash over her, so potent it almost buckled her. She looked up at David, and in his eyes she saw not a captain, but her husband. She saw the fierce, unwavering love that had been her anchor for 15 years. A single tear escaped and traced a hot path down her cheek. David's gaze softened for a fraction of a second as he looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. "Are you okay?" She gave him the slightest of nods. His attention then snapped back to the trio standing over her, and the ice returned to his eyes. "I asked," he said, his voice low and menacing, "what the problem was." He directed the question to Brenda, pinning her with a stare that could have frozen lava. Brenda stammered, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Captain, There was a mistake, a seating discrepancy. I thought she was in the wrong seat." "You thought," David repeated, taking another step closer. "Or you assumed. Did you assume, Brenda, that a black woman couldn't possibly be sitting in first class on her own merit? Did you look at my wife, a decorated surgeon who saves children's lives for a living, and see someone who didn't belong? Every word was a precision strike. He wasn't just defending Aris. He was dissecting Brenda's prejudice with surgical accuracy in front of her colleagues and a plane full of passengers. "No, of course not," Brenda floundered, wringing her hands. "It was just the system. Sometimes the system." David's laugh was cold and devoid of humor. "Let's talk about the system. Let's talk about the system where a veteran flight attendant feels empowered to harass a paying customer. A system where instead of verifying with the gate agent or looking at your own passenger manifest, your first instinct is to call the police on a woman sitting quietly in her assigned seat." He turned his piercing gaze on Officer Sutton. "And you, officer, did you bother to do any due diligence? Did you ask to see her ticket? Did you ask for her side of the story? Or did you just see a situation where you could exert your authority over a woman who you were told was disruptive?" Sutton, for the first time, looked uncertain. "Sir, I was responding to a request from the flight crew." "She is part of the flight crew's family," David cut in sharply. "A fact you would have discovered with a 30-second conversation. Instead, you chose to escalate. You chose to put your hands on her." He paused, letting the weight of his accusation settle. "That was a mistake." He then looked at Maria. "And you. As the supervisor, this situation is now your responsibility. You have a flight attendant who has at best demonstrated appalling judgment and at worst engaged in blatant racial profiling. You have an airport police officer who nearly unlawfully removed a passenger. And you have an entire first-class cabin of witnesses. So tell me, Maria, what are you going to do about it?" Maria was pale, her professional composure shattered. "Captain Thorne, I am so sorry. This is completely unacceptable. I don't know what to say." "I do," David said, his voice ringing with command. "First, Brenda is not working this flight. She is not to set foot on my aircraft again. You will find a replacement. If you can't, we'll fly with one less attendant. Second, I want your name and badge number," he said, turning back to Sutton. "And the name of your commanding officer. You will be hearing from my wife's lawyers, and from this airline's legal department." Sutton paled. This had gone from a routine removal to a career-threatening incident in the span of 2 minutes. "And third," David said, his voice softening as he turned back to the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the other passengers, "I want to apologize to all of you, particularly to the other passengers in this cabin who had to witness this disgusting display. This is not the standard of American Airlines. This is not what we stand for. We will be departing as soon as this situation is rectified. And to my wife," he said finally, allowing the love and fury to merge in his voice, "I am so sorry this happened to you." He reached down and took Aris's hand, his grip warm and steady. He helped her to her feet, and for the first time the other passengers saw them not as a pilot and a problem, but as a husband and wife, a united front against a tide of ugly prejudice. Brenda, standing in the aisle, looked utterly defeated. The architect of this humiliation was now the subject of it. Her career, she had to know, was over. The video cameras that were still rolling were no longer pointed at Aris, but at her. The whispers that filled the cabin were not about the disruptive woman, but about the flight attendant who had let her own bigotry bring a flight to a standstill. The karma was just beginning to circle its wings, casting a long, dark shadow over Brenda and Officer Sutton. The flight was grounded, but their careers were in a nosedive from which they would never recover. The removal of Brenda and Officer Sutton from the aircraft was swift and surgically precise. Maria, the supervisor, suddenly, a model of efficiency, escorted a stone-faced Brenda back up the jet bridge. Another airport police officer, a woman with a weary, apologetic expression, arrived to take Sutton's statement, her body language a stark contrast to his earlier swagger. He was no longer a figure of authority, but a man being questioned, his notebook out, his answers clipped and defensive. David remained standing in the aisle next to Aris, a silent, immovable guardian until both were gone. Only then did he squeeze her hand, lean in and whisper, "I have to do my pre-flight checks. Are you going to be okay for a few minutes?" She looked up at him, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a profound, shaky exhaustion in its wake. "I'm okay now," she whispered back, and it was the truth. The fear and humiliation were still there, buzzing under her skin. But they were overshadowed by a fierce, swelling pride in her husband and a profound sense of vindication. He gave her a quick, intense kiss, oblivious to the watching eyes, before turning and striding back to the cockpit with purpose. The click of the cockpit door shutting behind him was a sound of finality. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had undergone a complete transformation. The tension had not dissipated. It had curdled into a thick, awkward shame. No one seemed to know where to look. The businessman who had been staring so intently was now deeply engrossed in his newspaper, the pages held up like a shield. The man next to Aris, the armrest hog, seemed to have physically shrunk. He sat ramrod straight, his hands clasped in his lap, a full 6 inches of space now separating him from her. It was the honeymooning wife who broke the silence. She leaned across the aisle, her young face etched with concern. "That was unbelievable," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "I am so sorry you had to go through that. Are you all right?" Aris managed a small, genuine smile. "Thank you. I will be." Her husband nodded in vigorous agreement. "My wife is an attorney." He added a hint of righteous anger in his voice. "The way that officer touched you, that's assault. And that flight attendant. The whole thing is on video, Saw. We both recorded it." He held up his phone as proof. Suddenly, others found their voices. An elderly woman in seat 3A, who had watched the entire exchange with quiet disapproval, leaned forward. "That woman Brenda was rude from the moment we boarded. She was looking for trouble." "You handled yourself with incredible grace, dear." "Absolutely," a man in a crisp blue shirt chimed in from the first row. "I fly this route twice a month. I've had her before. She has a terrible reputation for being abrasive. But this was beyond the pale. Good for your husband for standing up to her." The validation was a soothing balm on a raw wound. These were the people whose silence had felt like complicity just minutes before. Now, with the power dynamic irrevocably shifted, their support flowed freely. Aris understood. It was easier to back a winner. It was safer to condemn the vanquished. She didn't hold it against them. She was just grateful for the shift in the tide. Her seatmate finally turned to her, his face florid with embarrassment. "Ma'am," he mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. I apologize for what I said. I was out of line. It wasn't my business." "No, it wasn't," Aris said, her voice neutral. She did not offer him the easy comfort of, "It's okay." It wasn't okay. His eagerness to see her removed his impatience with her seen was part of the problem. His apology was a start, but it didn't erase his initial reaction. He seemed to understand this, because he simply nodded and turned back to his window, silent for the rest of the flight. A replacement flight attendant arrived, a kind-faced man named Carlos, whose immediate action was to offer Aris a bottle of water and a warm blanket, his eyes full of sincere apology. "On behalf of the entire crew, Dr. Thorne, I am deeply sorry for what you experienced." The service for the remainder of the flight was impeccable for everyone. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, a full hour late, David's voice came over the intercom. It was the standard professional pilot's announcement, welcoming everyone aboard, stating their flight time and cruising altitude, mentioning the weather in Chicago. But at the very end, he added something that was decidedly off script. "And once again," he said, his voice calm and clear, "I want to personally apologize for the unacceptable delay in our departure. It was caused by a personnel issue that has been dealt with decisively. We at American Airlines are committed to ensuring every single passenger feels safe, respected, and welcome. Thank you for your patience." It was a masterfully worded statement. It acknowledged the incident without sensationalizing it, reassured the passengers, and subtly underscored the gravity of what had happened. It was a final public rebuke of Brenda and Sutton, and a clear message to everyone on board. During the flight, as the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Aris finally allowed herself to process everything. She watched the recording on her phone. The audio was crystal clear. Brenda's condescending tone, Sutton's threats, her own voice tight but unwavering, and then David's voice cutting through it all like a sword. She felt a fresh wave of anger, but it was a different kind now. It was a cold, purposeful anger. This wasn't just a personal insult. It was a systemic failure. Brenda hadn't acted in a vacuum. She had acted with the confidence of someone who believed the system would back her up, that a police officer would automatically take her side against a black woman. And she had been right up to a point. The system had worked exactly as she'd expected, until it had run headfirst into a variable she could never have anticipated the pilot was the woman's husband. What if he hadn't been? The thought sent a chill down her spine. If David hadn't been on that flight, she would have been dragged off that plane. She would have been at best detained and forced to rebook her vacation ruined. At worst, she could have been arrested, charged with some trumped-up offense, her face and name plastered across the internet, her career jeopardized. She would have become another statistic, another story for people to cluck their tongues over before moving on. She saved the video file and emailed it to herself, her husband, and her lawyer. She then began to write. She wasn't just a surgeon. She was a meticulous researcher, a precise and powerful writer. She documented every detail of the encounter, the time, the words, the names, the witnesses. She noted Brenda's selective service, her initial appraising stare, the lie about another passenger. She detailed Sutton's immediate escalation, his refusal to listen, his physical contact. By the time the plane began its descent into Chicago, she had a 6-page detailed account of the entire incident. It was not the writing of a victim. It was the preliminary report of a woman preparing for battle. The vacation could wait. First, there was a reckoning to be had. The hard karma was just getting started, and Aris Thorne was going to make sure it hit its targets with the full, unyielding force of justice. The fallout began before Flight 1252 even touched down at O'Hare. The videos uploaded by the honeymooning couple and at least 2 other passengers had gone viral. The hashtags were already trending, flying while black. American Airlines, assault marked captain wife. The internet, in its swift and often brutal way, had already passed judgment. Brenda identified within an hour by former colleagues who were all too happy to dish on her long history of being a nightmare, was the primary target. Her social media profiles were discovered and flooded with vitriolic comments. Her photo, a smug selfie taken in her uniform, was now the face of corporate bigotry. Officer Sutton was not spared. His name and the Los Angeles Airport Police Department were blasted across Twitter and Facebook. The LAPD's media relations line was inundated with calls from reporters. His own department, terrified of the public relations nightmare unfolding, immediately placed him on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. For Aris and David, the arrival in Chicago was surreal. As they stepped off of the jet bridge, they were met not by an empty terminal, but by a small, somber delegation of American Airlines executives. The head of Chicago operations, a woman named Catherine Royce, stepped forward, her face a mask of profound apology. "Dr. Thorne, Captain Thorne," she said, her voice sincere. "I am the director of operations here. On behalf of the highest levels of this company, I cannot begin to tell you how horrified we are by what happened on that flight. There are no excuses. We would like to offer you our most sincere and unreserved apology." They were whisked away to a private lounge where they were offered food, drinks, and anything else they might need. The airline had already refunded their first-class tickets, upgraded their hotel suite, and arranged for a private car service for the duration of their stay. More importantly, Catherine Royce assured them that a full high-level investigation had been launched. "Brenda has been suspended without pay effective immediately," Catherine stated, her tone firm. "Pending the outcome of the investigation, which I assure you will be swift, her termination is all but certain. We have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior. It is a cancer in our organization, and we will cut it out." She then turned to the matter of Officer Sutton. "Our corporate legal team has already been in contact with the Los Angeles Airport Police Chief. We have formally submitted all our internal reports, crew statements, and copies of the videos. We are demanding that Officer Sutton be permanently removed from any duties at LAX. We will not have our passengers subjected to that kind of unprofessional conduct." It was a textbook example of corporate damage control, but Aris and David could tell it was more than that. Catherine Royce seemed genuinely appalled. The incident wasn't just bad pro. It was a fundamental betrayal of the trust that passengers place in an airline. The next few days, which were supposed to be the start of their vacation, were a blur of phone calls. They spoke with their lawyer, who was giddy with the amount of evidence they had. They gave official statements to American Airlines' internal security team and to an investigator from the LAPD's Internal Affairs Division. The hard karma for Brenda was swift and merciless. She was fired within 72 hours. The flight attendants' union, after reviewing the videos and seeing the mountain of evidence against her, refused to contest the termination. Her 25-year career was over-ending in public disgrace. A former colleague leaked to a popular blog that Brenda had been passed over for a promotion to purser 3 times in the last 5 years, and her bitterness had become legendary among the Chicago-based crews. She had seen Aris a successful black woman in a seat of privilege and had been consumed by a resentful jealousy that had clouded her judgment with catastrophic results. She was now unemployable in the industry she had built her life around. For Officer Sutton, the process was slower, buffered by the bureaucracy of a police union, but no less inevitable. His past record, it turned out, was not pristine. The investigation revealed 2 prior complaints of excessive force and a handful of informal accusations of racial bias, all of which had been dismissed. But this time, the evidence was public, irrefutable, and viral. The key witness against him, besides Aris and David, was Maria, the ground supervisor. In her official statement, she admitted that Brenda's story about a passenger waiting at the gate seemed flimsy from the start. She stated that Sutton had shown no interest in de-escalation and had immediately sided with Brenda, ignoring Aris's calm and rational explanations. He had, she testified, been eager to make a physical removal. Facing a high-profile and likely very expensive civil lawsuit from the Thorns, and immense pressure from the airline, one of their largest clients, the airport police department cut its losses. 3 weeks after the incident, Officer Sutton was given a choice: resign or be fired. He resigned his law enforcement career over. He lost his pension and his badge, a man undone by his own lazy assumptions and a reflexive need to assert his power. But Aris wasn't finished. The personal apologies and professional consequences were necessary, but they weren't enough. This was about something bigger. With David's full support, she decided to forego a personal financial settlement. Instead, their lawyer negotiated a landmark settlement with American Airlines. The airline agreed to a multi-million-dollar fund to be administered by a third party to establish a new mandatory training program for all 130,000 of its employees worldwide. The program, developed in partnership with civil rights organizations and diversity consultants, would be called the Thorn Initiative. It would focus on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and cultural competency. It would use the video from Flight 1252 as a case study in what not to do. Furthermore, American Airlines agreed to revise its policies on involving law enforcement in customer service disputes, requiring a supervisor's approval and a documented, verifiable offense before police could be called onto an aircraft. The news of the settlement made national headlines. Aris Thorne was no longer just the pilot's wife. She was the doctor who had turned a moment of personal humiliation into a catalyst for systemic change affecting an entire industry. One evening, about a month after the incident, Aris and David were sitting on their back porch. Their vacation had been postponed, but in its place was a profound sense of accomplishment. "You know," Aris said, swirling the wine in her glass, "the worst part of it all was that moment when he put his hand on my arm. I felt so powerless. I felt like I was just another body to be processed, another problem to be removed." David reached over and took her hand. "You were never powerless, Aris. You were a rock. You were calm, you were strong, you were brilliant. You just needed a little backup." She smiled, her heart full. "I got the best backup in the world." The hard karma had indeed hit back, not just as a destructive force, but as a creative one. It had destroyed 2 careers built on foundations of prejudice and arrogance. But from those ashes, it had forged a powerful new tool for understanding and respect. Brenda and Sutton had tried to put Aris Thorne in her place. Instead, they had inadvertently given her a platform to change the world one flight at a time. The months following the settlement were a strange new landscape for Aris and David. They had inadvertently become public figures, symbols of a fight they hadn't sought. Aris received hundreds of emails and letters. Most were supportive, filled with stories from people of all races who had faced similar, if less dramatic, moments of disrespect. They thanked her for her courage, for not backing down, for turning her ordeal into something constructive. But there was also a dark undercurrent. A stream of hateful messages found their way to her hospital email and their home address. They called her a race baiter, an opportunist, a liar. They defended Brenda and Sutton, painting them as victims of cancel culture. They accused her of playing the race card to get a payout. The venom was shocking, but it didn't surprise her. It was the frantic, desperate cry of a worldview that felt threatened. Every step forward for equality was to some a loss of their own unearned privilege. The hate mail only reinforced the necessity of what she had done. David, too, felt the ripples at work. Among his fellow pilots, he was a hero. He had done what every spouse dreams of doing, swooping in to save the day. He had defended his wife and upheld the integrity of his command. But he also heard the whispers in the crew lounges. Some of the older, more conservative flight attendants saw him as a traitor. He had sided with a passenger against one of their own. They grumbled that Brenda had just been doing her job and that things were too sensitive these days. The division was a microcosm of the larger societal conversation playing out in the break rooms and galleys of American Airlines. But the tide had turned. The Thorne Initiative was now a reality. Every new hire, every seasoned employee sat through the mandatory training. They watched the shaky cell phone footage from Flight 1252. They saw Brenda's sneer, Sutton's aggression, and Aris's composure. They heard David's voice cut through the tension. The training was uncomfortable. It forced people to confront their own potential for bias, their own blind spots. It wasn't about blame. It was about awareness. And slowly, it began to work. Carlos, the flight attendant who had replaced Brenda, told David that the atmosphere among the crews was changing. People were more mindful, more careful with their assumptions. The phrase, "Don't pull a Brenda," became unofficial airline slang for checking your prejudice at the door. One afternoon, 6 months after the incident, Aris was at a fundraising gala for her hospital. She was standing by the silent auction tables when a man approached her. He was the businessman from the flight, the one who had hidden behind his newspaper. "Dr. Thorne," he said, his voice hesitant. "I don't know if you remember me, but I was on that flight to Chicago." "I remember," she said, her expression polite but neutral. "I just wanted to apologize properly," he said, looking her in the eye. "My silence. It was cowardice. I saw what was happening, I knew it was wrong, and I did nothing. I was worried about being late, about getting involved. I was selfish, and watching you stand your ground and then seeing your husband, it made me feel deeply ashamed of myself. He paused, swallowing hard. I went home and talked to my own daughter about it. She's in law school and she's a passionate advocate for social justice. When I told her what I did, or rather what I didn't do, the look of disappointment on her face was profound. It was a wake-up call for me. So I just wanted to thank you. Not just for what you did for yourself, but for holding up a mirror to people like me. I'm trying to be better. This apology, so much more than the mumbled words from her former seatmate, landed with profound weight. It was the ripple effect in action. It was the quiet internal shift in a single person's heart. "Thank you," Aris said, and this time her smile was warm and genuine. "That means a great deal to me." The final piece of the story came nearly a year later. They were finally on their rescheduled vacation, sitting on a beach in Hawaii, the turquoise water lapping at the shore. David was reading a novel, and Aris was scrolling through the news on her tablet when she saw a small article from a local Los Angeles paper. The headline read, "Former airport officer sues for wrongful termination, cites anti-police climate." She tapped the link. The article detailed Officer Sutton's lawsuit against the airport police department. He claimed he had been a scapegoat fired to appease a corporation and a politically correct mob. He was seeking reinstatement and back pay. His lawyer argued that Sutton had been following standard procedure, but it was a quote at the end of the article from an unnamed source within the department that caught her eye. "Sutton's case is going nowhere," the source said. "The man is his own worst enemy. The Thorn incident wasn't an isolated event. His internal file reads like a manual on how not to be a cop. The only reason he lasted as long as he did was that his previous victims didn't have a voice or the resources to fight back. This time he picked the wrong person. He didn't just run into a pilot's wife. He ran into a woman who knew her worth and a system that was finally, if reluctantly, forced to listen." Aris read the quote aloud to David. He put down his book and looked out at the ocean. "He never understood, did he?" David said quietly. "He and Brenda both. They thought the world was a simple hierarchy with them somewhere near the top. They thought the uniform and the badge made them right. They never realized that true authority doesn't come from a uniform. It comes from integrity." Aris leaned her head on his shoulder, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sound of the waves a peaceful rhythm. The ordeal had left a scar, a permanent mark on her soul. But it was no longer an open wound. It had become a part of her story, a testament to her resilience. The hard karma had not just been about punishment, it had been about rebalancing the scales. Brenda and Sutton had been weighed and found wanting. Their fall had not been a tragedy. It had been an adjustment, a correction back to fairness. They had tried to remove her from a seat she belonged in. But in the end, they were the ones who were permanently removed, while she and David sat right where they were supposed to be, together, looking out at the endless open horizon. This wasn't just a victory for one couple. It was a victory for everyone who has ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unworthy. Dr. Aris and Captain David Thorn didn't just get an apology. They forced a multi-billion-dollar corporation to confront its own failings and implement real, meaningful change. The Thorn Initiative stands as a powerful reminder that one voice speaking with clarity and conviction can change a system. What started as an ugly moment of prejudice became a catalyst for progress. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of justice and karma. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments below.